All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. My name is Katie Latanish. I work as council staff, and I'm the council's climate project manager. So thank you for joining us today for our final virtual discussion. This is the last of 3 virtual sessions we're holding leading up to the council's Climate Scenarios Workshop, now just in about 3 weeks in June. Just as a reminder, before we get started, this is being recorded and live streamed, and this, along with the other 2 videos, will be available to watch on the council's YouTube channel. And there are also links here on the workshop website. Let me just put that in the chat. So if you didn't get a chance to see the first 2 of these, you can see the YouTube recordings here. So the purpose of the workshop, many of you have been to these previous sections and are very aware of the workshop, but just to recap, the purpose is to generate short and long-term ideas for management approaches and tools to help improve climate resiliency of federally managed fisheries in the North Pacific. And we're having this workshop because we don't know exactly what the future holds, though we know climate change impacts are going to become more intense. And so at the workshop, we'll be talking through hypothetical scenarios that are a way to help us think about how the future could look different. And scenario planning is an approach to help us think about multiple possible futures at the same time and the steps we can take to build readiness and resilience under all kinds of different circumstances. So the workshop materials just posted to the e-agenda last Friday. In just a second, I'll get the link and put that in the chat for you. Sorry, I'm probably trying to do too many things at the same time. Let me just put that in the chat and we'll move on. Okay, so here's the link to the workshop e-agenda, and you can see that there's a final detailed agenda posted. You can find the discussion documents with the 4 scenarios we'll be talking about at the workshop, along with some discussion questions, and also a welcome letter from leadership and other resources to help you prepare for the workshop. One of these includes a document called About the Climate Scenarios Workshop, which has answers to frequently asked questions and information on how you can participate. So we've had a lot of questions about how people can participate, and we want to make sure we're helping you feel that you can come prepared. So the workshop itself is going to include several small group breakouts, and there's going to be lots of time for discussion and for all of you to share your ideas. So there's more information about how you can prepare and where those opportunities for engagement are on the workshop website. And there are lots more details in the document I just told you about that's called, again, about the Climate Scenarios Workshop that's on the agenda. So this will have more information on how the breakout sessions are going to be structured, and also more details on how you can join as a remote participation or a remote participant. So one final reminder, if you have not already registered for the workshop, please remember to do that by this Friday. We'll do our best to accommodate people who register after Friday, but for planning purposes, this is really helpful. We're already expecting a pretty large group. And sorry, I skipped over those slides. This is the document I was referring to that's called About the Climate Scenarios Workshop. It's got answers to all kinds of questions about how to participate and prepare. So as I mentioned, this is the 3rd of these virtual sessions. The purpose of these was to do a little pre-thinking and pre-discussion so we could all start thinking about the ideas and questions that are likely to come up at the workshop, so we can all come better prepared to have a good conversation in June. So on the agenda for today's meetings, there's a quick discussion guide and some slides. And as I mentioned, the video recordings of our past 2 sessions are also available on the council website. So the focus of today's 3rd and final session is an introduction to climate scenario planning and the 4 hypothetical scenarios we'll be talking through at the workshop in June. We just have one speaker today. We're going to hear from Kirsten Holzman with the NPFMC Alaska Fisheries Science Center. Kirsten's talk is going to be pre-recorded, and then she's going to join us for Q&A, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion and next steps. So just give me 1 second and I'll go ahead and get that video loaded.
Hello everyone, welcome. Today we're going to talk about scenario planning in general, and then we're going to talk a bit more in specifics about the climate change scenarios that we envision exploring during the June workshop. My name is Kirsten Holzman. I'm a researcher at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. I work on climate change and fisheries. I'm a co-chair of the Climate Change Task Force along with Diana Stram. And before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the hard work of the task force over the last 4 years, and in particular for their work and efforts and feedback on helping frame these scenarios, drive the methodology, and then provide a bit of feedback on some of the questions. So really appreciate their contributions to date. And then I'm going to just make myself a bit smaller. Here we go. All right. So the reason that we are holding this workshop and doing it in the format of a scenario planning is that we know that climate change is already impacting the systems in Alaska and the fisheries and fishing communities that depend on them. And those changes have been large, especially compared to the rest of the world. So warming in the Arctic, for example, is 4 times that observed for the rest of the globe. Looking forward, we anticipate that we'll continue to see some degree of warming, but there's considerable uncertainty about how that'll unfold. It really depends in large part on some of the actions over the next decade of the global community in terms of mitigating atmospheric sources of carbon, which trap solar radiation and create the warming that we see. And so looking forward, we may have continued warming, but maybe just something a little bit above what we've seen. That would be kind of the best case scenario if we're able to implement all of the measures that have been proposed to date. Or we may see considerable warming that well exceeds anything we've seen previously. In those 2 scenarios, things like marine heat waves, for example, are expected to increase relative to what we've seen in the last century. Anywhere from occurring once every 10 to 100 years under sort of the better scenario to once every 10 years or even annually, so multiple times a decade under the warmer scenarios. Planning to address this will require a comprehensive approach. And if you've seen me talk in the last couple of weeks, you've probably seen me put the slide up. This is a summary statement from the IPCC's Working Group 2, and it really addresses the multiple pieces that go into climate change planning. In terms of effective adaptation planning, climate change depends on society's willingness to anticipate the change, recognize its effects, and plan to accommodate its consequences, and eventually implement a coordinated portfolio of informed decisions. Informed solutions. And that's really where we're trying to get. So scenario planning can help get us there. It can help us gather and organize the information, tools, and support for navigating future change, especially under considerable uncertainty. Now, there's a lot that can actually be done in terms of climate change adaptation. Of course, mitigation is an important piece of this, carbon mitigation, but also how we plan to respond to changes that may be occurring. It really drives the outcomes of future risk. So what we can do is threefold. We can help inform prediction and sort of give a heads up for what's coming. We can plan for those things that we know are coming and also the things that we don't have a lot of certainty about. And we can prepare, so we can set things up to help minimize impacts should the changes materialize. And in the typical fisheries assessment sort of process, the components that go into that, there's also a lot of places where adaptation occurs at each of these steps. So starting in the upper left, you can see adaptation in the biology. So individual fish may adapt through genetic adaptation. They can also have different foraging strategies. They can have behavioral responses to exposure to things like heat or changes in ocean pH. Populations can redistribute, so you can see adaptation at the population level. On the management side, we can adjust our targets depending on if we think marine heat waves are going to occur or changes in carrying capacity have occurred. Management can also use strategic advice around seasonal management or spatial management, for example, or ecosystem-based management to help improve adaptation and resilience and sustainability. And fisheries and individuals that are fishing can employ a number of adaptation responses to help navigate climate shocks. And finally, communities can help support adaptation through providing multiple options for people during some periods of climate impacts. So scenario planning can help us take all of those potential adaptation actions or policies or tools and organize them into a way that provides synthetic advice. And if you Google scenario planning online, you'll actually find quite a bit of information. There's a lot of great tutorials, some YouTube videos. Scenario planning has been around a long time from the corporate world. It helps people navigate some of the uncertainties that can come with markets and things like that, or supply chains. Applying it to the climate realm is actually really helpful because again, those uncertainties can drive a lot of potential changes in the resources that we manage. And so I liked this set of summaries. It's directed towards organizations and sort of the corporate world, but it applies here as well. And you can go to the link if you want to find a little more information. This is a nice overview. So scenario planning is a strategy that organizations can use to consider possible future events so they can develop effective and relevant long-term plans. It differs from forecasting because it considers trend analyses and qualitative data in addition to examining quantitative data and past events. And regular and consistent scenario planning can help organizations allocate resources, successfully mitigate risks, and decrease costs. This is another helpful graphic. This is from the National Park Service. And so apologies, there's obviously no ocean element to this figure, but it is a nice illustration. And so I wanted to bring it to you all now. On the left-hand side is traditional planning. On the right-hand side is scenario planning. So if you look at traditional planning, it's kind of assumes that the future will largely resemble the past. There's a high certainty in the ability to accurately predict the future. It encourages a very precise characterization of the future, and it can leave, there's a lot of advantages to it, but it can leave managers vulnerable to surprises in situations of high uncertainty or in our case, climate shocks. Now, scenario planning assumes somewhat differently. It assumes the future will likely differ from the past. It recognizes uncertainty and asks what might happen in a more rigorous and structured way. It encourages broad and open-minded exploration of future possibilities and surprises, and it can help managers identify strategies that are robust to uncertainty. Now, there's a lot of different types of scenario planning out there. You've probably come across some of these over the years. They range from qualitative to quantitative. And I was just going to step through a couple of these that we will bring into the workshop in June. The first is quantitative scenarios. So now, if you've also heard me talk, you've probably heard me talk about ACLIME, our Alaska Climate Integrating Modeling Project. There's a similar one in the Gulf of Alaska right now. These are highly quantitative projects designed to look at best and case, worst case scenarios under climate, and also understand how that might translate to changes in fisheries, ecosystems, and livelihoods and well-being. These quantitative scenarios assume that those key variables or aspects that are identified have fixed relationships, or that they're the relationships that we use to establish them, which uses historical data, will hold true going forward. Now, these can look like projections. So here's an example from an ecosystem status report from a couple of years ago out of ACLIME. Here we have the best and the worst case scenarios for future climate. The top row is temperature, the bottom row is pH. And you can see we can quantify some of the uncertainty there because we're doing this using numerical models. Similarly, we've tied these into a bunch of different ecosystem and food web models over the years and biological models to help understand what this means in terms of changes in catch and risk and ecosystem functioning. But for the workshop in June, we will just be drawing on some of the kind of 30,000 foot elevation understandings that come from this. So some of the climate background and some of our understanding about species and how they might respond will frame the discussions, but it's not the focus. What we're actually going to do in the June workshop is talk more about things like operational scenarios or event-driven scenarios. And these look at the effects of how an event might impact an organization. So an example at the top here is two regimes. This is from the Northeast. So just, it may not map exactly to Alaska, but it's a really nice figure because it shows this idea that there might be some condition in the system somewhere in that middle threshold. The system has crossed that threshold, and now you have a different regime. So you can have these kind of maybe equally productive regimes, but they look very different and might have different species in them. These operational scenarios help us navigate things like, what if there are more marine heat waves, or they're occurring at a increased frequency, or warming is kind of a permanent shift. And it allows us to look at some of those changes and explore them in a qualitative way. The other thing we'll be bringing into the mix in June is normative scenarios. And these are really goal-oriented. This is often what we think of. You start with where you want to be and how do you get there kind of approach. And in the case of the council, we have a number of ecosystem and sustainability targets that we're trying to meet. And these normative scenarios help us say, how do we get to those under future scenarios? And that brings me to the last one, which is the strategic scenarios. These are referred to as alternative futures. And so we're going to do a bit of this. So basically, how do we get to our target if you have a couple of different types of futures emerging? Now, we're doing this in a participatory way because holistic solutions emerge from a plurality of perspectives. The more people we have in the room, the more perspectives, the more shared experiences and expertise, the better the outcome at the end, the better the understanding of the options and impacts on the other end of the workshop. And we're doing this not with the goal of necessarily achieving consensus, but actually to have that diversity of ideas of what might happen, or some of perhaps there'll be shared solutions that emerge out of that. Perhaps there'll be identified places where adaptation for one group might interfere with adaptation for another. And those are really important things to have come out of these types of discussions. Now, this is a key aspect of scenario planning for fisheries management. And here's another great resource. We'll link it as well, but it's here in the PDF if you want to click on the link there. And this overview talks about all the different types of scenario planning that are underway for fisheries management advice. And the key here is, again, that scenario planning allows you to work and plan with uncertainty as part of the assumed future state. And stakeholder engagement is key to this. It confers benefits not only in the moment of the workshop, but also benefits that transcend the planning process. Inclusion of diverse groups of opinions contributes to a broad knowledge base, and importantly, it sets up a process for exploring these going forward, because the results of the scenario project or planning effort may not be realized for some time, and they may be dynamic. There may almost always need to be iterations and feedback incorporated into that process. So they give lots of examples of different scenario planning aspects, and if you're wanting to get a few more ideas about what goes into this, this is a great resource, and I've put these figures at the end of the PDF of this presentation as well. But the basic idea is you usually take two contrasting kind of realms and use that to set up your scenario. So you might have a gradient of change from low to high, for example, warming, or changes in precipitation. And then you would have another gradient of low to high of something else that you want to explore in this space. So it might be a management measure, it might be access, it might be, if you're looking at hydro release amounts, for example. And then that matrix makes up the four quadrants make up your four different scenarios. So in our case, the Climate Change Task Force explored a couple of these different ones, discussed them, and identified through feedback from the SSC and feedback from the public, two axes that would be useful for this workshop. The first is around predictability. So predictability being high on the right and low on the left. So higher predictability might be associated with less severe changes in the climate. And lower predictability might be associated with higher amounts of climate change, more frequent climate shocks, for example. And then EBM was a kind of exploring the realm of different types of ecosystem-based management and inclusion of different information sources into management advice from moving from where we are at to maybe more siloed, which would be the lower part of the graphic, or moving to more holistic, inclusive, and cross-sectoral coordination, which would be at the top. And those 4 quadrants then create our contrasting scenarios, and we'll talk about those in the next few slides in a bit more detail. Before I go to that, though, I did want to kind of introduce this idea of a continuum of ecosystem-based management for fisheries management. And this is based on a framework that Dolan et al. Put out in 2016. It's really helpful for organizing the kinds of information that you have. In truth, often we pull from different aspects of this in a particular management or fisheries management approach, but it does help in this case to help us organize it. And so we might probably characterize the council's processes here at ecosystem-based fisheries management. It's using ecosystem information in strategic and tactical ways to help inform management advice. So that might come in form of the risk tables. It comes in form of the ecosystem status reports. We have our social economic profiles, the ESPs that come into each stock assessment. And the process of analyzing stocks and discussing targets is done together. So we're doing multiple groundfish stocks together at once. And so you can also articulate some of the effects of one management action or biological reference point on another stock. And so that interactive component of it across the ecosystem lands it sort of squarely in this ecosystem-based fisheries management approach. Now we might consider, and on our graphic on the right, that star then is right in the middle. So that's our starting place. And then as we go forward, we might explore a realm where we bring in additional sectors to those decision-making discussions or to the target setting, different sources of information for framing advice. And fisheries then is one sector amongst a couple of different sectors that are being evaluated. An example of this from the East Coast is there's quite a bit of exploration right now of the intersection between wind sighting and fisheries activities. In our neck of the woods, shipping, for example, and fisheries would be more cross-sectoral discussions. And then you might also imagine that there could be a situation where management has to make decisions much more fast than they do now, and that could lead to siloing. So rather than doing this all together, we branch out and do different parts individually. And this would be a step towards something like ecosystem approaches to fisheries management, which are more commonplace in Europe, for example, where the stock is the focus of the advice. You might still be bringing habitat in there and predation in there, but it's really with the single stock being the focus rather than the stock's effect, changes in the stock's effect on other components of the ecosystem being considered. The other axis that we plan to explore is that of climate. And so again, starting in the middle, we're having a kind of an intermediate degree of warming going forward. So in this graphic, the red on the left is the historical climate, in this case, bottom temperature in the Bering Sea. And on the right is the future climate under sort of an intermediate warming scenario. And so you can see there that there's increased variability. We see some regime kind of characteristics to it. And that might be what we could call status quo. So what we're dealing with right now, but just transposed in the future with additional warming and uncertainty built into that. Then we might consider, well, what if we had nations were able to pull together all of the targets, all of these carbon targets, they were able to meet them. And we had also new innovations and technology that allowed us to minimize emissions and maybe even do recapture. So you could kind of explore this hypothetical future, which is possible still, where warming is not really very different than what we've seen in the last 2 decades. So we still have regimes going forward, but it's within the range of historical conditions. And then we might also explore a future where warming is accelerating rapidly. And this is actually more in line. There's a lot of argument about which future trajectory we're on. This one is more in line with continued current energy policies amplified by future global population growth. So this is a future where we continue to do what we've been doing today, but also you have increased demand because of increased numbers of people in the world. And in this future, we see quite a bit of warming, also a lot of variability and uncertainty, and then starting somewhere around 2060, 2070, the conditions in the Bering Sea far exceed anything that has been seen historically. So those sorts of realms frame things, and we'll provide more information during the workshop, and we'll have facilitators there to help navigate these, but they're the background for discussions. And so what we want to do is, as we go through the scenarios in each of the breakout sessions, we kind of want to think about, where are we right now? How would you define that? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the impacts? And then move forward into this kind of normative future. Where would we like to be? What does that look like? How do we get there? What are the things that are in place? What's already started now that can get us there? And then we'll go kind of take a shift to the left and say, well, what if you have this cross-sectoral coordination, you have ecosystem based management, you have the ability to do that and execute that management policy, but you do have this higher warming. Rest of the world is really contributing to warming as well. So we're just dealing with increased unpredictable futures, increased warming, and that will allow us to explore which additional tools we might need in that scenario. And then finally, what if we're in this future of large unpredictable settings, and again, we have to make decisions really rapidly. Now we're moving into more of a siloed approach, and what would be lost in that? What sorts of things would we want to see to have this be a successful future? What things would we just not be able to navigate? And really articulate those and identify those from your own standpoint and from your own point of view. So how do you prepare? So we keep talking about this is interactive. We want your input in this setting. Well, bring your personal expertise and experiences to the workshop. That's really key. This is why we're doing this in an interactive way, as you all have the knowledge and experience, and we need to bring that together so we can form some of these shared solutions. Come ready to share ideas, to brainstorm, come ready to listen to others, and try to connect dots in real time if you can, of possible mutual challenges and shared solutions. And then finally, plan to generate a diversity of considerations and responses. So if there aren't shared mutual solutions or challenges, this is the time to sort of raise that and articulate that here there are some conflicts that there may need to be trade-off analyses around. And that will all form kind of the basis of the advice that goes forward through the council process. So here are some of the set questions. These are available in the links for on the agenda. And the key here is to read through these and kind of think about how you might respond in a group setting. And then what we'll do with those outcomes is there'll be a workshop report. These will help connect dots, again, map out tools, policies, and inform resources, but really with a council focus in this report. So we're really trying to generate some of the information come into the council process. But within that, we will also identify those elements that might help inform the things that the agency is doing and help connect with those resources, fisheries, communities, and individuals and families. So the focus is the council, but there will be a lot of information here that can be informative beyond the council process. And I just put this up. These are some of the types of management actions. This is from an older slide from the council. It's not only this list, but this is a starting place to give you some ideas about the things that this might inform. And then finally, those might be linked into various products like scientific tools and information on-ramps. Okay, so with that, I'll go ahead and stop and answer any questions. And again, please feel free to reach out if you have questions offline. If you're listening to this not in real time, you can email me. I should have put my email there, but it's available on some of the handouts, or you can talk to Katie as well over at the council, or Diana, and they can help you with that. Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for listening. Look forward to seeing you in June.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your presentation, Kirsten. And Kirsten's actually going to join us live for some Q&A and discussion in just a minute here. Before we do that, I just wanted to follow up with a few additional slides about workshop outcomes and next steps. So hang on just a second. And as we're waiting, you can be thinking about any follow-up questions you have for Kirsten. So just a few things I wanted to emphasize before we move into discussion, because we have had a lot of questions about workshop outcomes and outputs. I did want to emphasize that no decisions will be made at the workshop. And I think Kirsten put that really nicely too. When you said that the objective is not consensus. This is an idea generating opportunity. And so all ideas are on the table. This is, everything's valid. Some of the outputs from our discussions may include ideas for climate readiness, objectives, needs, challenges, and potential solutions. And these are all things that the council could choose to explore through future management actions. There's also an element of this workshop that's kind of educational and also building a shared frame of reference. We're at the beginning of this 3 or 4 years of an opportunity to really take a coordinated approach to climate readiness planning. And so this workshop is helping us develop a shared vocabulary and an understanding of the challenges and potential solutions. So we're kind of laying the foundation for a work that's going to carry us through the next several years. We've also had a lot of questions about how the workshop links to the programmatic evaluation. And so some of the broad concerns and themes that come up at the workshop discussions could help inform the council's consideration of alternatives once we move into the programmatic evaluation. So I think workshop discussions will kind of help identify those, help us think about how we talk about climate readiness and where those opportunities for further discussion are. As Kirsten mentioned, there are lots of things you can do to get ready for the workshop. We'd encourage you to review the workshop materials. They're not very long, especially the scenarios and the discussion guide. Just take a look at those. It's about 10 pages total, and just think about the scenarios and the discussion questions. Most of all, just come prepared to listen and learn and share your experience, and also think creatively. Again, thinking about hypothetical scenarios is something that's a little bit different from most people's council meeting experience. So we're kind of pushing our boundaries and willingness to think creatively a little bit. So it should be an interesting discussion. And most importantly, we have a lot of people attending the workshop and a lot of diverse perspectives, and it's really important for all of us to come in with a respectful attitude and recognize that all experiences, perspectives, and worldviews are valuable. And again, we're not trying to reach consensus. We don't have to agree with each other. This is really a chance to hear what everybody has to say and do a lot of idea generating. And then finally, next steps following the workshop. I've probably mentioned this before, but we have a lot of breakout groups and a lot of people, and we're going to have a lot of discussion that's happening side by side. So there's going to be a lot of work after the June workshop to synthesize and aggregate all this information and think about how to organize all of this in a meaningful way. So at the June council meeting after the workshop, there will be a final discussion about the workshop during staff tasking. So I'll do like a preliminary recap of some of the themes and ideas that came out of discussion. Then in September, we'll have the final workshop report ready. And then in October, a council discussion of next steps. And this will be the opportunity to consider how ideas from the workshop may fit into new or existing council initiatives, and the council consider how and when to take further action. So that's it. I'll stop sharing now. And if anybody has any questions for Kirsten, we've got about 25 minutes for discussion. This is pretty informal. So if you have a question for Kirsten, you can go ahead and just raise your hand. And maybe while we're letting you think, Kirsten, I'll get you started with the first question, which is that in all of our scenarios, we talk about predictive tools. And in some cases, they're better than others, or our capabilities are more advanced, or we're investing more in research and technology. So can you tell us a little bit more about what we mean by predictive tools? What are they? What are we hoping we can predict? And what are the limitations of those?
Yeah, I think we're and hopefully you can hear me okay. Sorry if there's some background noise. But yes, I think we're envisioning here kind of an inclusive definition of predictive tools. So predictive tools and information. So that can include inherent understanding about the system and understanding of, oh, I think my Zoom just disconnected. So you might not be able to see me, but hopefully you can still hear me. Understanding of where we might be going. On the quantitative side, on the agency side, we're also building models that connect climate forecasting. There's some new generation models coming out that promise capacity to predict out a decade from now. So sort of like you have with your weather apps on your phone. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. Depends where you're at and the season you're in. Those same sorts of tools that will be available at a seasonal, monthly, year, and then decadal forecasting capability. And what we're doing right now is trying to evaluate the skill of that. If we have a good understanding of how climate influences fecundity of Pacific cod, for example, we can forecast out some of the productivity changes in a species, or the distribution of where species are. And so those are quantitative tools that have some predictive capability. They tend to work better when the relationships aren't pushed to the edges of historical connections. And I think that's probably true about our understanding and inherent information as well, is once it exceeds it's sort of unprecedented conditions, it's hard to predict if what we've known in the past will translate to the future.
Thanks, Kirsten. We've got a couple hands up. So first we'll hear from Rebecca Skinner and then Kristen Stahl-Johnson. And you can unmute yourselves to ask your questions.
All right. This is Rebecca Skinner. It looks like I'm coming through. Yeah, thank you for the slides and the presentations. I will say it's a lot of information, particularly from the perspective of someone that doesn't work in this realm at all or in a day-to-day basis. So my question, and hopefully I'm going to use the right words in the right context, but one of the approaches you talked about was a normative approach, I think, where we identify goals. So I think these were the different kinds of scenario planning you could do. But I want to talk about the one where you identify goals. So my question is with that one, which I think you called normative, can you talk a little bit more about give examples of what those goals would be? I think while you were speaking, you said or to perhaps like a goal be sustainable management. And I'm wondering, would that be the goal, or would the goal be a more specific kind of goal? And if so, can you give us an example of what that goal might be?
Yeah, actually, a fantastic question. Thank you for asking it. I think there's kind of two parts to the answer. The first is we are coming with some sort of predefined ideas of goals that are based on the council's. There's some ecosystem goals and objectives that have been set, some goals that the council has. There are also some legal mandates that have to be met. So those are some that are existing, but the opportunity here too, and especially with the scenario, which is, for lack of a better word, we're kind of calling it, if you it's kind of the nirvana scenario, if you could have what you wanted in the system, what would that look like? And help articulate goals that might not yet be captured there. So information flow, equity goals, things like that we might want to bring up. This is an opportunity to also raise those and define those. And so that's part of that first scenario we plan to explore after the status quo. So it's sort of two-part. And I think, Katie, it's a good question about some of the existing goals, and what we could do is probably link to the existing ecosystem goals that are already established, and that would at least provide a starting place. So thank you for raising that question.
Thanks. And we had another question from Kristen Stahl-Johnson.
Hi, thanks for hearing from me. Can you hear me okay? Good. I was wondering, I know that we have this legal mandate of MSY and how the modeling is all based on all of the assumptions and parameters you pump into that, but there's so much to question about that approach, that modeling approach, given all these changes. Are we prepared to look at something different? Are we moving towards an idea of how do we replace that current system that clearly doesn't, in my opinion, hasn't really been working all that well, but in the future, given this these serious changes, and how can we justify using that approach any longer? Thank you.
Kirsten, before you respond, I just want to make sure we're not putting all the burden on you to respond to some tough questions. That's a great question, and there are lots of other staff and council members and SSC members on this call. So if anybody would like to respond to the question or make any comments, please go ahead and raise your hand, and you're welcome to. Diane, go ahead.
I understand that's a big question, but I do. I really, it's a burning question for me. Thank you.
Looks like Diana Stram has a hand up, so you can let Diana go first and think about that in the meantime. Go ahead, Diana.
This is Diana. Hopefully you guys can hear me. This is Diana Stram, council staff. I'll take a shot at it while Kirsten's thinking. I think that's a fantastic question. I think that at least the way that I've been trying to conceive of this and the conversations that we'll have next month, I wouldn't think of it as a whole new system. I think what we're trying to do is figure out where we should be looking at tweaks in a system that you can argue whether or not you think the system as a whole is working. But I think what we're trying to do is figure out the modifications that might be needed to be better prepared for climate resiliency. So hopefully that helps. I think it's scary to think of it as we're not trying to create an entirely different system. What we're trying to do is modify the parts that are working and figure out where there could be tweaks to make modifications to make things more resilient moving into kind of an unknown future.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. I wanted to give folks a few opportunities to jump in, and I agree. I think thinking about the existing system, we'll spend a bit of time on the first day talking about where we're at in the system that we have presently in order to kind of get on the same page about that, and then thinking about how that would perform and tweaks to that is important. But kind of towards the larger, there are discussions about how do we make climate resilience part of some of our longer term targets, and I think this would be a good opportunity to raise those as well. And so if there are things that it's not addressing, raising that and articulating it, and there are discussions, and I'm kind of waving my hand towards the background here because I'm on the East Coast today. There are discussions higher up about some of those national targets and mandates. So it's perfect. Bring that to the workshop. That's a great question.
Thank you.
We have another question from Patty O'Donnell. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I was a little late getting on here. So I only got the last 10 minutes or so, but you were talking about predicting out a decade, and I kind of have two things to address here. So in dealing with climate change, have we looked at historical data from the National Weather Service and incorporated any of that into moving forward on predictions and the accuracy of predictions and how effective they were looking forward? And again, the same thing you mentioned, pod, and I'm assuming we're dealing with the 2017 survey that's seen a reduction in cod stocks 81% or whatever, but doing that prediction on species moving forward, and particularly cod, where the surveys on cod are done, particularly in the Gulf of Alaska, in the summertime, when cod are not aggregated and spawned, and whereas pollock, for example, the acoustic survey in the Shelikof and Gulf of Alaska is done during spawning when they're aggregated. But have we looked at the historical predictions over time? I know there's a lot of data and a lot of information out there, both within stock assessments and surveys. and also looking at the National Weather Service and historical data, but I'm trying to wrap my head around how we predict a decade looking forward. That's the challenge. In as much as everything's changing, and we the fishermen are seeing things differently on the fishing grounds than what maybe the surveys will capture due to timing, because surveys are fixed and they like to have them fixed and in the same box at the same time every year, which may serve a purpose, but I think in light of conditions as they're changing, we need to change, and the model needs to change, and we need to look at things a little bit differently. So I'm just curious if that's all going to be addressed. I don't want to get sort of into a funnel here where we're, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to come up with a different outcome, or trying to predict the future based on what we've historically done, because I don't think that's the way forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Patty. I'll jump in, and if there's others on the call that want to also talk about this, you're welcome. One of the things that came up at a workshop we had at the start of ACLIME was, I think we asked, what's the ideal time frame? If we could give you the information, what would be the best time frame? And of course, a couple of years out, and then the next right in line there was 10 years out, and we kind of all like hung our heads a bit, because we knew that was a difficult time frame to predict. And I didn't expect this to happen so quickly, but there's this new generation of climate models. They've just published a paper for the East Coast that has a pretty good skill at a 10-year period. So they trained it on one set of data and then predicted out 10 years forward, and were able to capture a warming regime that happened on the East Coast. And so we don't know yet if that will work for the Pacific. I think those decadal climate forecasts are slated to be completed in 2026. So we're looking at the skill of those. And then the next layer you brought up, which is really important, is the how much skill do we have? If we had perfect climate predictions, we still would have some uncertainty in the coupling to the biology. So understanding the key aspects, you mentioned a few there, spawning, timing, and what drives distributions or aggregations, how our observations, which are critical to understanding the skill of these methods, how those play into it. And so that is ongoing work. We won't at this workshop necessarily get into it, but sort of the framing that you put forward there is the sort of thing we want to talk about. So those tools are being developed, and identifying the key directions and sort of the targets for those, because we can't do everything at once, is really helpful from a personal standpoint. And then there's the last, which you talked about, which is the kind of how we interact with the resources. That's another bit of it. So understanding how people adapt, what things enable adaptation if species shift, what are the factors that come into being able to account for that or deal with that. And both on the management and the individual level are all very important perspectives. And so that's the kind of information gathering that we're hoping to do with this workshop.
Thank you, Kirsten. I don't see any other hands up, but again, if you have any other questions or comments, please go ahead and put a hand up. And in the meantime, Kirsten, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the different levels of ecosystem management we're going to be talking about in our scenarios, because I think we tend to use these acronyms and talk in the language of ecosystem-based fisheries management, ecosystem approaches to fisheries management, and ecosystem-based management. And they can kind of get confusing, and we want to be sure we know which ones we're talking about. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to where the North Pacific Council is right now in our incorporation of ecosystem information into decision-making, and how that differs from what we're talking about in kind of a full ecosystem-based management future.
Yeah, happy to. And they're all somewhat artificial categories, because in truth, it's a continuum. All right. But we tend to try to organize in this way, so we have an ability to talk about where the management intersects with different types of information. So in ecosystem-based fisheries management, it's a sector specific focused on fisheries. So it's fisheries management, like looking at fisheries management as the primary decision place, but accounting for both the impacts of the ecosystem on fisheries resources and also fishery management and fishery activity on the ecosystem. So you're accounting for both of those formally rather than in context. And that's the important piece. An example from the Bering Sea is the 2 million ton cap on ground fish, or the lower biomass cutoffs for some of the prey, to preserve prey for some of the marine mammals. Those are ecosystem-based fisheries management measures. As we move to true ecosystem-based management, and there's kind of elements, there's like ecosystem-based management light and full, and we don't see a lot of examples of full, but that's where you're managing in coordination with other sectors. So often this becomes somewhat spatial, and there may be efforts to try to manage critically important areas or sensitive areas, some development examples from the West Coast, aquaculture siting and wind development and fisheries and shipping, right? Those are cross-sectoral. And so coordinating those rather than having each sector make a decision separately, if you coordinate them together, that's ecosystem-based management. And the key there is the groups of people and the coordination and the communication. So bringing together different representatives from different components of a system to discuss together and make decisions together is the core of ecosystem-based management. And so you can kind of extrapolate that out for what that might look like in Alaska if we were doing more cross-sectoral, sector being shipping, fisheries, community planning, etc. So cross-sectoral discussions, and then the flow of information that feeds into that as well in a formal process.
Thanks so much, Kirsten. We appreciate it. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. So another question I wanted to ask you is about helping people understand the differences in management between our 4 hypothetical scenarios. And so we use the words like focusing on stability or short-term yield or long-term stability, or in some cases, we're in a more reactive management regime, where in other cases, we have more lead time for planning. So it's something you could just talk us through a little bit about how the kind of management framework or the management focus varies between these scenarios, and how kind of why the scenarios are designed that way, and what kind of questions those are meant to prompt us to think about.
Yeah, I think the idea is to use, we have 2 days, and so we wanted to structure the discussions a bit to explore a couple of different spaces. And so starting with the status quo, defining what we think of as the current state, some of the things that might work there in this currently have been working, some of the things that are not working, identify those and articulate those. And then on the second day, as we move into these alternative futures, thinking about moving again to that realm where we have a lot of predictive capability, maybe through information and understanding, through more stable climate, and through things like information sharing and ecosystem-based management processes set up for exchange and trust building. So explore that, identify what is a strength of those, what are the things that we would like to see in that realm, and then move from there towards, well, would this work in a future where we had a lot of climate-driven change? Because one of the hardest parts about planning going forward is the uncertainty about which future trajectory we're on. And so starting with where we would want to be, and then seeing which elements would perhaps work really well in a future with a lot of climate change. And I'm in my mind, I'm drawing my map across the quadrants, but that's the kind of second future scenario we want to look at on day 2. And then finally articulating, we currently have ecosystem-based fisheries management. That process is set up, has a good success of bringing ecosystem information into the management process. What if we had some situations that created siloing? How would that come to be? Explore that a bit and identify the sort of pathways that lead to that, because it's really important to know sometimes if that would even be a future that worked, and if it's not, why not, and how do we avoid it? And so those are the kind of aspects of the discussions that we're hoping to explore, but do that from the perspective, multiple different individual perspectives. So that's the benefit of doing this together, is reflecting how that may look different to everybody involved. And then Katie gets the fun task of summarizing it. So that'll be nice to see. But I think the key is to generate as much information during these discussions as possible, and to bring your own understanding and expertise to it. And it is an intimidating process. We're trying to make it the least intimidating possible. So it's easy to kind of get worried that you might be speaking to the wrong scenario, and that does not matter. What really matters is exchange of information, bringing up how climate's impacting, how responses that work right now need to be kind of carried forward, and that things that are missing need to be brought into the mix.
I was going to ask you another question, but I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I think we've heard that, there's a lot to think about in these scenarios that can feel daunting and intimidating, but at the same time, the discussion questions we're asking are meant to be pretty simple and straightforward, and all experiences and thoughts that people have about these are equally valid. And so again, this workshop's a chance to generate ideas and talk about what's most relevant to you. So Kirsten, I'm happy to turn to you for a last word if there's anything else you want to share with workshop participants before we see you all in June.
Just that I'm really excited to see everybody both in person and virtually at the workshop. I think it's a real testament to this community is coming together to solve this and to find some of those shared solutions. I'm excited to hear what people bring and the different perspectives. And I think that this is a huge step forward in identifying, brainstorming, and kind of laying out everything so that we can organize the pathways forward. Again, nothing from this is all perhaps what we might call council relevant, but nothing is necessarily going to be decided here. This is a low stakes way to share ideas, bring up some of your concerns, and really try to work together to find those common pathways forward. And so I'm excited, and I'm excited for the number of people that have signed up and the energy coming into it. It's going to be great.
Well, thank you so much, Kirsten, for your help today and for all the work that you've put into planning this meeting. And to everybody else, again, please look at the workshop materials and register if you haven't done so already. And we look forward to seeing you online or in person in Kodiak in just a couple of weeks. So have a good evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.